We are Betsy Bowman and myself, Cliff Duran, by the way. I recognize everyone in the audience. You probably know my name already.
Close the door.
Bob's still.
You're not going to hear it if
Okay.
you don't close the door.
Today we are taking off on a 4th of July theme, only it's declaring independence from Wall Street. Actually, that is quite consistent with the original Declaration of Independence, which was not only a declaration of independence from England, but also from the corporations that England, the King of England, had chartered to settle North America. And the so-called Founding Fathers had a very anti-corporate view. They were very suspicious of corporations. And in fact, the Boston Tea Party was a protest against the East India Company, tea company. So, to talk about today about declaring independence from Wall Street is very much in a venerable tradition of U.S. history, though obviously very controversial today because corporations have established immense power, both economically and politically. What we want to talk about today is some of the ways that people are finding to not establish complete independence from the big corporations, but at least some measure of control over aspects of their lives so that they're not as totally dependent upon the corporations as has typically become the case over the last half century. There is really a worldwide revolt beginning against the policies of neoliberal corporate capitalism. We see that in the Brexit vote. Working class, largely, Britons voted to leave the European Union because they were experiencing the negative impact on their standard of living, on their economic prospects, as a result of the neoliberal regime imposed upon them through the European Union. It also took the form of a protest against immigration, which of course was something that the European Union opened the door for. And the politicians who championed the Leave policy, the Leave vote, played upon those racial fears of others. We've also seen in Greece a revolt against the austerity policies imposed upon them by the bankers of Germany and France, basically squeezing the Greek people and reducing their standard of living in order to pay off the banks. The bailouts, the loans that went to Greece did not ever reach Greece. They went right into the coffers of the banks and saddled the people of Greece with increasing debt. We've seen also in the United States this revolt against the corporate neoliberal globalization. The declining standard of living or stagnant standard of living for large sectors of the working population is the Rust Belt, deindustrialization of the Great Lakes states, industrial heartland, the stagnation in standards of living, the erosion of the much vaunted middle class, are consequences of the neoliberal policies that have been championed by our political elite for half a century, at least since the mid-1970s. There has been bipartisan consensus. Democrats and Republicans alike have championed policies which have worked against the interests of working people in the United States. Globalization encouraged corporations to shift their production abroad, thereby eliminating the kind of entry-level industrial jobs that had once made it possible for a high school graduate to get a job in a factory, drawing good union wages, and with that be able to aspire to the American dream. A house in the suburbs, a car, vacations, college education for their kids, etc. That American dream is being seriously eroded, and in fact, large numbers are experiencing downward mobility rather than the upward mobility promised by the American dream. There's also concern about the loss of sovereignty and of democracy, as represented in the free trade agreements that the U.S. has embarked upon. They're called free trade agreements, but they're not really about trade. They're about protecting and expanding the power of the transnational corporations, which has an adverse effect on working people, on their jobs, on the environment, on a host of fronts. So we've seen in the United States the beginnings of a rebellion against that in the campaign of Bernie Sanders and of Donald Trump, both from the left and from the right. We're finding political voices that appeal to people who feel the insecurity, the precariousness of their lives and their futures as a result of the policies that have been promoted by the political elite. Until the current primary campaign, generally the political elite, both the Democratic establishment and the Republican establishment, had been successful in manipulating the political process to make it appear that it was democratic. What has happened in the current campaign is that they've lost control of that process. And as a result, the undemocratic character of the manipulations that they engage in behind the scenes has become apparent to more and more people. Basically, there is a crisis of legitimacy in the politics of the United States, as well as in the politics of Europe and many other areas. Here in Mexico, we see it also. The political elites around the world are finding that they're no longer able to control the political process as they have long been doing to favor the interests of transnational corporations. And so we see political crises as a result of that loss of legitimacy. We see the beginnings of potentially a worldwide revolt against corporate capitalism. Now, many have taken heart in the United States from the campaign of Bernie Sanders, who has offered a program and a critique that takes on the established policies of the elite. And many have come to the view that, well, maybe there is hope through the national political process to have our voice heard and to have an impact. Well, I think that the Democratic Convention later this month will dash what remaining hope there is in the hearts of people who are looking for an alternative. And I think that they will hopefully come to the conclusion that, well, we can't really bring about political and economic change through the electoral process on the national level. They will turn, as many in the Occupy Wall Street movement turned after that uprising was crushed. They will turn to trying to build local alternatives. And that's really what our panel is about today. The local alternatives that people are attempting to build. Things like cooperatives, which I'll be talking about later, public banking, which Betsy will be talking about in a moment, and other efforts as well to try to create, at the local level, alternatives that give us some independence from corporate capitalism, give us some measure of control over our lives. Whether that be in the form of cooperatives that give working people control over their workplace, so that they're not ruled by a boss and exploited by absent owners, but rather benefit from the fruits of their cooperative labor. Whether it be public banks that give communities some control over their investment and economic development efforts locally, or even such modest things as raising the minimum wage locally. I mean, that's not really an anti-capitalist thing, but if people have better incomes, that gives them a little more control over their lives, and a little less beholden to the corporate powers that be. The basic theme for our conference today comes from a conference that the Center for Global Justice held 2 years ago, titled Moving Beyond Capitalism. And this week, a book is finally being published that came out of that conference, Moving Beyond Capitalism. There are flyers on it that I passed around. And I hope that you'll want to get hold of this book. It's excellent articles from a variety of points of view. both from the global north and the global south. The table of contents are listed here in really fine print. If you get a magnifying glass, you can, you can see what's there. But with this flyer and the order code on it, you can get the book at a 20% discount. So take advantage. We don't have copies of it here yet. You know, the publisher is just releasing it this week.
Is it on Kindle yet? Is it on Kindle yet, or
It's Kindle?
Kindle?
Is it an e-book yet? No.
No, there isn't an e-book yet,
Wow.
but it is available on Amazon. You can also order from the publisher, Routledge. It's being published simultaneously in hardback and paperback. It's a little bit pricey. The paperback is $43.96, but with the 20% discount, that brings it down to the mid-30s, which is not that unusual for paperback books these days, unfortunately. This book is a part of a growing attention being given to efforts to create alternative economic institutions. I put up here a few websites that are useful in exploring that. There is the Next System Project, which is a very exciting effort to bring together ideas on how to begin to build the next system that can replace the present one, which is in crisis and collapsing around us. We need to begin to invent the alternative now, rather than wait for the catastrophe of the collapse. Well, I will talk about cooperatives as part of that next system, but first, let me give the floor to Betsy, who's going to talk about some of the financial aspects of an alternative.
Well, I'd like to start by saying that all of the experiments in alternatives is not just they're not just for the sake of the experience, but it is imperative that we build an alternative, because as capitalism is crumbling around us, and it is, we need to have something that will grow up in its place, that is growing in its place. And growing is the correct metaphor, because what we need to do is to, at least to further start, is to grow food. That's our first basic need, is food. We don't need to be able to build nuclear power plants and fighter jets and so forth, but we need food. So one of the things that the Center for Global Justice is doing is precisely that through the Saturday market at TOSMA, the Organic Farmers and Artisans Market. So we're encouraging organic farming, locally made goods, so that when you go to Comercial Mexicana or Mega and a head of lettuce is $45, you can go to the local farmer's market and get it for less. In addition to talking about public banks, I will get there, I wanted, my talk is entitled, "There is no Planet B, but there is a Plan B." And Plan B is, of course, building the alternative. And that's what we're consciously engaged in doing. And actually, Bob and Cliff and I and Liz have been talking about this for 35 years now, I think, together. And I remember in 1989, Bob and I visited the network of cooperatives in northern Spain called the Mondragon Cooperatives. We came back to the States and started talking, do you remember that? Started talking about cooperatives, and all of our left friends said, what about trade unions? And we said, well, you know, let's look at cooperatives. So now we're looking at cooperatives. Anyway, the main pillars of this alternative economy, Plan B, are public banks and worker-owned, worker-managed enterprises. Now, why are those the two pillars? Well, every society has to produce, has to save, has to invest. Okay, on the production side, what we've had is a system, the capitalist system, that is based on the workers and the owners of the means of production being different people, being separate. Well, you know, if the workers and the owners are separate, if I hire James and for $10 to make a chair, I give him the wood and the hammer, and then let's say the wood and the hammer cost $5, and then I go out and I sell the chair for $50, there's a $35 difference there. He gets 10, the materials cost 5. Oh, but I'm the owner. I get the 35. Now, there's never going to be justice under a system that is based on the separation of workers and owners. Now the opposite of poverty, you know, is not wealth, but it's justice. That's why we're the Center for Global Justice. We're not the Center for Global Wealth. We're the Center for Global Justice. You'll never have a system of justice that is based on separating the workers from the owners. So that's the first pillar, and that's why we focus on worker-owned, worker-run cooperatives. And I have a whole list here up there, hang on a minute, of experiments in that vein. Now, why public banks? What's wrong with, you know, the banks that we have? Why, you know, what's wrong with private banks? Well, we need banking services. We need institutions in our society where you can hold your savings and where people can go for investment capital. Now, banks pretend that they're available for investment capital, and the stock market pretends that it is a means by which capital is allocated to the most profitable undertaking. Well, maybe it is. Maybe it is allocated to the most profitable undertaking. But let's take Detroit, Michigan. Detroit, Michigan has been a depressed, impoverished city now for 30, 40, 50 years. And someone might say, well, what does Detroit need? We all know that in so-called poor neighborhoods, there are no decent grocery stores. What Detroit needs, probably to start with, is a farmer's market. Or they need food. People need food. They need healthy food. But the bankers who control investment might say, you don't make money off of growing food. Let's build a factory that makes guns. That's much more profitable. So public banks being publicly managed by the workers at the public banks, by community representatives, being democratically managed to meet the needs of the local community, they're going to say, no, we don't need a gun factory. Are you nuts? We need food, food that is healthy and that we can afford. And then we'll get on to, clothes and so forth. Now, Cliff mentioned that globally there is a worldwide uprising, and that's true. And it's really sort of exciting. We thought it was going to get started at the end of the 60s, and that, impeaching Richard Nixon was just step one, and we didn't anticipate this 35 years of neoliberalism. But now is the time when we can talk about real alternatives and justice and equality. We also want equality as the basis of justice because, well, if we're talking about Plan B, public banks, worker-owned, worker-run enterprises, we need not just a new, an alternative economy, but we need an alternative culture, an alternative way of understanding what it means to be human. And I think there is a real crisis in, what does it mean to be human? It seems like half of the world is trying to find ways to find solutions to poverty, and then the other half is trying to find ways to get rich and make more poverty through that process. So we have to, sort of the ethical, spiritual, moral basis of our vision is that no one is expendable. Huge parts of the planet have been written off as just sacrifice zones. And those sacrifice zones are always poor people of color or poor white people. But nuclear waste dumps are never built on Fifth Avenue. So the idea that our entire culture, at least since Ronald Reagan, is based on the basic sort of view that, poor people are just, it's their fault, they're expendable, we don't need them, they're lazy, the entire culture is, we're going to cut food stamps, we're going to cut health care, we're going to cut this, we're going to cut that. The entire world is saying to poor people, which is 90% of the global population, just in the words of Mike Whitney in a Counterpunch article, just go fuck off and die. And that is pretty much the contempt with which our rich, arrogant leaders dismiss 90% of the world's population. It's just like, if you didn't have rich parents and you didn't get a good education, it's not my problem. This contempt for people, this absolute commitment that no one is expendable, no one is cast off, everyone is included, we're all in this together, no one can be excluded. This is the moral basis of rejuvenation of our culture on which a new economy can be built. On the one hand, I might be calling for a renovation of the Enlightenment project of freedom, equality, and fraternity. But that for me is plan B. The elites, they're scared. They know the pitchforks are coming. They don't know what to do. But we do. We actually do. Well, we don't really know what to do about the nuclear waste problem. I don't think anybody does. But of the people that I've talked to over the last 35 years, and the books that I've read, and the articles that I've read, we, as a group, we know what to do. We know how to green our economy. We know how to stop climate change. We know how to grow organically. We know what's healthy and what's not healthy. We know all these things. We know how to convert from a militarized production system of guns and weapons to a civilian economy. I mean, Seymour Millman, a professor at Columbia University, was writing about that 30 years ago. We have the alternatives. We know what to do. And the elites are just, especially today, when it turns out, this morning I went to my web browser and typed in election fraud. Because for the first time yesterday, Bob and I were watching the documentary that people have put out about the election fraud in the California primary. Have you seen this? Oh, it's unbelievable.
What's the title?
Does it have a title?
Uncounted or something?
Well, it's on a program. We started watching on a program
The
called
Young Turks.
put out by the Young Turks, Redacted Tonight, or Censored Tonight. Redacted means blacked out. Redacted Tonight. And it turns out that Bernie Sanders won the California primary. Put into your browser, election fraud, and I got 12,900,000 results. Now, a lot of this election fraud are in, those countries, those poor countries in Africa, or those little poor counties in Appalachia where the dog catcher's race was fraudulently won, whatever. But Hillary Clinton, California primary election fraud, it's all over the place. And there is a court case that has been filed both about fraud in the New York primary and fraud in the California primary, and I don't know what other cases, but the legitimacy of the system has collapsed. I mean, look, we're going to have a Democratic candidate and a Republican candidate who are known around the world as scumbags, liars, and fraudsters. Anyway, what is the public bank solution? So, we need public banks for savings and investment. We need worker-owned, worker-run business enterprises to produce the things that we need. And people are doing this around the world. You should take a look at Ellen Brown's book. Yeah, you should read it. The Public Bank Solution, From Austerity to Prosperity, it's called. And
what is the public bank as opposed
to a private bank?
Okay. Who owns it? The state?
There are many examples. And in this book, you'll read about all the examples. The best known example in the United States, and there is proposed legislation to introduce public banks on this model around the country, is the Bank of North Dakota. You need some more? The Bank of North Dakota. Cliff is from North Dakota. I don't know why he's not talking about the Bank of North Dakota. All of the state money, all of the money that the state collects for, your driver's license fees and your fees for this and that and your property taxes and so forth, all of that money, there are only 300,000 people in North Dakota. It's not a big place. But all of that money, goes into the Bank of North Dakota instead of Goldman Sachs. And the public employees are paid from that. Well, now we're starting to talk about, more than $15. So the teachers and fire and police and so forth. So a public bank can be based, regionally, geographically. It can be owned by the state. The Bank of North Dakota is owned by the state of North Dakota. It's usually the Bank of North Dakota doing business as, though the state of North Dakota doing business as the Bank of North Dakota. So that's its basis, its capital basis, is the state income. And then it is run with the goal of providing capital loans for local investment. And the reason why the state of North Dakota survived the 2008 collapse better than any other part of the country is because of its public bank. There used to be a public bank run through the post office. This is very common in lots of countries around the world, and we actually used to have one here in the United States. Now, the public bank could be owned by the state. It could be owned by a geographical region like, North Dakota. And by the state, I mean the federal government. But who makes the decisions within the public bank are public servants. They might be hired by the state, or they might be community stakeholders. But investment decisions are made based upon democratic input into the decision-making process. So instead of putting the toxic waste dump in the poor neighborhood in town, they make, or building the gun factory, they make other decisions. So Ellen's book goes through, just a host of examples and models and so forth. Public banking through history from 3000 BC, to the present. So solutions, banking as a public utility. So please take a look at Ellen's book, and it gives a complete description of everything that a public bank could be. We only need to think of the 2007 financial meltdown, which will happen again, to consider that maybe we need an alternative to the private banks. And I'll just mention one little statistic. The bailout of the 2008 banking crisis in the United States, most people think that it cost $700 billion through the Troubled Asset Relief Program. TARP, remember that? Mm-hmm. Now you gotta laugh. Troubled Asset Relief Program? Whose troubled assets? The banks or yours and mine? What about the 4 million home foreclosures? Was there relief for them? Not much. But the Troubled Asset Relief Program turned out to cost not $700 billion, but 16 or 17 trillion dollars, which is money that is borrowed from the banks and given back to the banks. I mean, you really have to, to figure out what's going on, you have to leave sanity and rationality behind, because it just doesn't make sense. The other person to read on this topic is David Schweiker, and I didn't bring my copy of his book with me today. His book, called After Capitalism, has a whole model of a society that is built on worker-owned, worker-run enterprises, otherwise known as cooperatives, and public banks and public decision-making in the investment process. So that's the only dire news and a terrible statistic that I'll burden you with today. So I think that we're at the beginning, or well into actually, of a period of transition. You know, and I think that capitalism as we know it ended in 2008. When the private banks go to the government begging for a handout, capitalism is over. And when the government actually gives them the money, and then it doesn't nationalize the banks as it should have or could have, and when the government has given the taxpayers money to the banks because they made a lot of reckless, irresponsible decisions, well, you know, that's what I would call socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor, you know. Oh, foreclosure on your house? Sorry. Fuck off. So, the other reason for the importance of cooperatives is that the elites don't know what to do. The global economy is stagnating. I was just at my nephew's wedding, and he's a middle school teacher, and he's making the same salary that my sister made 25 years ago. I didn't tell him this. It was his wedding. I didn't want to ruin it. And, you know, but it's the same salary. So the stagnation, stagnation based upon what criteria? Oh, growth. Why do we have to have growth? I think growth is sort of killing the planet. All of this growth. You need it for CEOs to give themselves huge salaries, for top managers to get big bonuses, for stockholders and to get dividends. You have to have growth because otherwise the stock price plunges. But in an economy based on self-management or cooperatives or worker-owned, worker-run enterprises, growth is irrelevant. And if you have one hamburger stand, the people who work there and who own it are not going to have more money or more vacation or more anything if there's another hamburger stand that is run by the workers and owned by the workers. You know, it doesn't work that way. So the growth imperative all of a sudden collapses. So, and the problem of stagnation, stagnation is a problem only for people like Larry Summers, who are pushing the whole growth, profit model. It's not a problem for worker-owned, worker-run cooperatives. So I think I'll stop there. I don't even know.
Okay, well,
And you can go on with the description of
Okay.
cooperatives.
yeah, let me pick up and expand on the idea of cooperatives. And I want to put cooperatives in the context of being a commons. Commons are, those spaces or institutions or practices that are available to the members of a community and that benefit their lives in some way. Here in San Miguel, the Jardín is an example of a commons. It's available to everyone to enjoy, or Parque Juarez. But not only are public parks examples of commons, but also public education is a commons. The internet is the knowledge commons.
About the library.
The library, yeah, that's also an example of a commons. Now, basically, a commons is a resource that is available to the members of a community and governed by that community in some way. And it contributes to the development of the members of the community. Now, what capitalism seeks to do is to privatize commons and make them something from which a profit can be extracted. They seek to privatize the commons, turn them into a commodity for a profit. Certainly we're seeing that happen with regard to public education in the United States. Public parks and other public facilities are also being privatized. I mean, that's really the major thrust of what we've been calling neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is to enclose the commons, commodify them so that they can become profit centers for capital. Now, the struggle to move beyond capitalism, whether it be in the form of public banks or worker co-ops, can be seen as an effort to reclaim the commons, to bring them back under the governance of the people who depend upon those resources. Capitalism grew by privatizing the workplace, changing workers from frequently self-employed craftsmen into wage laborers, so that they had to sell their labor for a wage. In effect, their labor became a commodity because workers no longer had control of the means of production. A cooperative, a worker-owned cooperative, can be seen as an effort to reclaim that workspace for the people who work there, to reclaim the commons, to re-socialize it, so that it is socially controlled rather than controlled by absentee owners, stockholders or millionaire investors. So what I want to suggest then is a way of looking at cooperatives is to see them as a reclaiming of the commons that is represented by the workspace. And we're seeing this effort to commonize or socialize the workspace through the formation of cooperatives. We're seeing it blossoming around the world. A growing number of worker-owned cooperatives in the United States, throughout Europe, Latin America, around the world, as people are trying to regain some control over this crucial resource that they depend upon for their livelihood, namely their work. So they don't have to sell their labor power. They have their means of production in common and govern it in common for their collective benefit. One of the places where we see this socializing or reclaiming of the commons of the workplace is in Cuba. Liz and I both just returned from a 2-week visit to Cuba. The Center for Global Justice organized a trip to Cuba, focusing on the new cooperatives there. We had 32 people, also included for part of the time Yolanda Mayan, who is our co-op organizer here in Mexico. And it was really fascinating to see what Cuba is undertaking to do. To make a transition, not as in a capitalist society, reclaiming the workplace from capital, but in the case of Cuba, reclaiming it from the state. Because under the state socialist model that has prevailed in the 20th century, certainly, where the state was the agent of socializing the workspace in the name of society as a whole. Now, unlike that, what Cuba is trying to do now is to socialize or re-socialize, re-commonize those workspaces based upon those who are directly in control of the means of production, who actually possess the means of production. So rather than having a state-run restaurant that usually wasn't very well run, sometimes it was, but often was not. Now what's happening is those restaurants are being turned over to the people who work there, who had been state workers, but now are becoming members of a cooperative. Given control over their workplace, they still don't own the building, they're leasing it from the state, but the business they own collectively. And that shift, and it's a shift filled with all kinds of problems and difficulties, away from a state-centric socialized economy to a cooperatively based socialized economy, is unleashing all kinds of potential. As state workers, well, the people who worked in the restaurant got paid whether the restaurant was profitable or not. They had job security, they had their income, etc. So there was no incentive to to do a better job. Now, as cooperatives, they have an immense incentive because their fate collectively is in their own hands. If they do a good job, and the restaurant is successful, then they will prosper. If they don't, it'll go under. There are no guarantees provided by the state any longer. And the experience so far has been that the cooperatively run enterprises in Cuba result in their members' incomes increasing threefold or as much as sevenfold over what they have received as state workers. And that's because there's the incentive there. Now, it's often thought that, well, cooperatives are all small businesses, and often they are, but not necessarily. One of the cooperative restaurants that we visited in Havana has 200 members. Many, of course, are much smaller. There's an interesting study that was published earlier this year, a worldwide study of cooperatives that showed that rather than cooperatives being small, in fact, on the average, when compared with individually, privately owned businesses, cooperatives are larger. They have more members. So we're seeing a very interesting experiment in Cuba, trying to reclaim the workplace commons for those who are actually employed in the workplace, so they can collectively control it for their common benefit. Reclaiming it from the state, and in the United States, Europe, other places, we see a similar cooperativization or socialization of the workspace, reclaiming it from capital. Well, I just wanted to throw out that perspective on cooperatives because it ties in with something that we long have appreciated but taken for granted, and that is the commons that exist even in a capitalist society. Public parks, libraries, educational institutions, public schools, even the streets and roads are part of the commons, which of course capital is trying to privatize. I mean, they will try to privatize anything they can in order to be able to extract a profit from it. Well, we need to be more aware of how important the commons are in our daily lives and how they need to be defended and reclaimed from capital. Okay, enough said on that. Let's open the floor for comments and questions. Yeah, James.
Yes, I was wondering, has Cuba been rated on the scale that ranks countries with regard to distribution of wealth and income and that sort of thing? And is there a trend, perhaps, in response to the initiation of a favorable national policy toward cooperatives and so on?
While Cuba is opening up the non-state sector of the economy to cooperatives, it is also opening it up to small, privately owned businesses. So a lot of the new restaurants that you see around Havana are privately owned by entrepreneurs who employ wage labor. I mean, they are small, they're petty capitalist enterprises. And that is resulting in an increase in the inequality of income in the population. The standard measure of equality, the sociologists and statisticians use, is called the Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient is a number between 0 and 1. 0 means there'd be no inequality. Everybody would have this at the same level. 1 would be maximum inequality. I guess where someone like Bill Gates would own everything. Right? And Cuba has had a very low Gini coefficient. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it's not 0, it's something like maybe 0.35 or something like that. Under the reforms underway currently now, that is increasing. There's an increase in inequality, primarily as a result of that private sector. It's still far more equal, though, than the United States, where you have not only Bill Gates, but CEOs of many corporations receiving hundreds of times the income of their workers.
Now, they have a steeply sloped income, don't they, that tends to partially compensate for this increased advantage of the private enterprises. I'm not sure I said that understandably.
Can you expand a little bit on what you mean?
Yeah, the private enterprises have an advantage, which is reflected in the Gini coefficient. Is that partially compensated for by increased taxation on their income?
Yeah. The policy in Cuba is to prevent the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few. And so the private enterprises are heavily taxed, they're licensed and regulated. This is a fairly new sector of the economy, though, and they have not developed a regulatory regime that is adequate to the task. But they recognize the challenge of the increased inequality or concentration of wealth in the hands of a few that could result. And so they're trying to find ways of preventing that from happening. One of the problems, of course, is that in a country like Cuba, where most transactions, especially at restaurants, are in cash, not credit cards. They don't go through the banking system. It's in cash, so it's very easy for these privately owned businesses to conceal how much income they have so as to escape taxes. That's one of the problems that we came to appreciate as we investigated further. We visited, I don't know, maybe a dozen co-ops, something like that. 8 or 10 at least co-ops during the 2 weeks we were there. And we found a great variation in conditions there. But we also visited some private businesses, the paladars, the private restaurants.
Is tipping encouraged or discouraged?
Oh yeah, tipping is expected now. 10%. In some places, there's just a 10% surcharge added to the bill automatically.
Is that both in the cooperative and the private restaurants?
Yes.
I can see it in a restaurant, but how do you produce jumbo jets with a quart?
Well, clearly
What was the, how do you produce?
produce jumbo
Jumbo
jets.
Jumbo jets, okay.
Yeah.
I could address that.
Okay, go ahead.
The network of cooperatives around the town of Monterrey in northern Spain they specialize in the white line, so in appliances. So actually started out by making little Bunsen burners. So they make all kinds of very sophisticated manufactured products. They also make very technical products. So it's not beyond the ability of a cooperative. Now, there would be a problem funding such a cooperative to make jumbo jets, because you do need a lot of material and but it's not a problem due to difficulty or something like that. That's the way I would respond to that.
But does it require the public banks, in order to get the investment, say for all the steel and all the expensive?
Yeah, I would think so.
Mondragon has its own bank, right?
Right, the Mondragon has
However-
its own bank. That's a very important point that I forgot to mention. Bob, do you have any other?
One of the challenges of manufacturing of things like jumbo jets or other such sophisticated industrial products is that you need a large workforce. There are so many components that go into something like that that you can't have like a single workshop of even, say, 200 co-op members doing the whole thing. It's a much larger scale. Now, you can break it down. You could have a co-op making one component, another co-op making other components, and then an assembly co-op that brings them all together to produce the finished product. So you can have self-governing cooperatives that are coordinated in some such way. One of the problems, of course, is that the ideal that we usually think of in a co-op is that it is a self-governing productive unit. However, no co-op operates in a vacuum. It has connections with the larger society. And even though, for example, the people who live in the vicinity of Parque Juarez may have a direct interest in things like security at nighttime, for example, in the park. And so they might reasonably have a lot of say in the security practices there. But the larger community of San Miguel also has an interest in that. And so you can't just make it a locally self-governing commons. There are larger commons representing the interests of the society as a whole or the larger community that also have a say too. And that would certainly be the case with something like producing jumbo jets. I mean, there is an interest that, well, to make it most expansive, there's an interest that the world's population has in having few efficient, non-polluting forms of transportation. Now, the workers in that complex of cooperatives that make jumbo jets have a primary interest in their jobs, but the larger society has an interest in saying, well, maybe we need to direct investment into other forms of transportation that are not fossil fuel based. Right? So, the governance of commons gets to be very complex. It's not just a matter of the the members of a single cooperative operating autonomously from the rest of society. Yeah, Liz.
Just one thing on, I don't know the answer to your question about co-ops and general chess, but there is material which I don't know a lot about on the interest on the capitalist side in promoting worker self-management in major industries like the auto industry, for example. Just recognizing the higher productivity of labor when they're actually involved in their day-to-day functioning. So that doesn't address any control over the surplus they produce or the profits, but it does produce, it is, it creates greater involvement in like doing a good job. I had my sister-in-law work for a furniture manufacturer on the assembly line, and they were fighting for having control, having teams, you know, just to humanize their day. So like conceptually, there's no reason why people couldn't self-manage a large industry. It's how do they get control of it in the first place?
The takeover is one way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
As in Argentina.
yeah, the takeover.
Yeah, Chris.
I was going to say that the difference between Boeing aircraft and Airbus is that a lot of the manufacturing for Airbus, which is the main competitor for Boeing, is that it's spread over, I don't know, 4 or 5 countries within Europe. And many of those are semi-government, non-profit organizations, which brings up the idea that there is a role for government in these larger operations and things. Whereas the American version was that the military always played a big place in aerospace. And eventually Boeing just bought up everybody, you know, I mean, that made airliners. They took all the civilian market. And then they always said, well, we only make civilian aircraft. Well, now they're the largest military contractor for aerospace. So basically you have 2 examples of the way Europe decided to go at passenger aircraft versus the capitalist version, which was to take many companies before World War II, particularly, fewer companies after World War II, and then basically make it just one large company.
Yeah, and I understand that in the Washington, D.C. area, there's a whole new growth of McMansions or mansions that are owned by the military contractors. So,
Yeah. How do you evaluate because I don't quite fully understand the Uber transportation model? Uber?
but I don't know what that is.
Oh no, it's in your handout.
It's here on the,
It's this device. Well, I can answer it
it's
if you
like
guys
Airbnb.
There's a big controversy. I was just out in the San Francisco area where it started, and then I follow Latin American news.
I thought
Yeah.
you said Hoover.
That's what I thought
Okay,
too.
yeah.
But Uber,
yeah.
Uber's a mixed bag because basically it's called the gig economy where no one will have a regular job. It's sort of the contrary or the moving away from the idea of unions in the workplace because basically everyone is working for themselves. If there aren't enough people calling Uber for rides, you just sit at home, you know, or maybe you sit in the car. Maybe that's all you have. Some of them just live in their cars. And Uber finances the car, they can. And then they can actually lower what they pay, which they've done in some circumstances.
They finance it.
Yeah.
Like a traditional bank.
Yeah. So it's the gig economy, which a lot of people think is driven by the technology of cell phones, but or smartphones. But it's hard to really tell. I mean, you know, in Latin America, they find one of those guys. They'll have taxi guys that just pull them out of their car, destroy their car, beat up the Uber driver. I mean, it's just they have, you know, to be a taxi cab driver in a lot of countries, even here, is a respected profession, and it's often protected by licensure and everything. Uber comes in. It's the same with Airbnb. They come in. and like San Francisco's fighting them, New York City's fighting them, because basically they're driving out all the lower income housing in these larger cities. So basically the gig economy is a very mixed bag. You know, it's hard to
I
evaluate.
wanted to say that one of my nephews works for Tesla out in the Bay Area. And his job is to go around to the different teams and talk with them about the ideas that they have for improving their productivity or their work, or how the workers get along. Because how the workers get along and how they feel about their jobs has a lot to do with the profitability of the companies. So feeling better about your job is nice, but it's not socialism.
Oh, no,
Yeah, one of
it's capitalism.
one of the points I would add about Uber is the way in which it individualizes work, separating people from one another, making each worker a precarious employee, but not really an employee, no. They are, the fiction has it, they are independent contractors, they are self-employed. Now, contrast that with, say, the Fordist model of capitalist production, where thousands of workers are brought together to work on an assembly line, etc. But in a situation where communication among them is possible, it's possible to form unions and bargain for better conditions and so on. Yeah, the Uber model really is the neoliberal model of the labor process par excellence that totally disempowers workers.
Is there someone that
Under the fiction that, oh, now you're independent.
is there someone that actually owns that?
I think there is.
It's a huge industry and growing.
Yeah.
Uber, Airbnb, the so-called sharing economy.
Sure.
It involves, there's zero sharing, as a matter of fact, because there's no voluntary participation in sharing those resources with someone else. It's mediated completely by a profit-making web networking system, which basically siphons off, under the name of sharing, huge gains. It's argued that Airbnb, Lyft, Uber, all of these now fabulously growing enterprises are a degeneration of what used to be called, at the turn of the millennia, the gift economy. That's open source software which is truly put together by voluntary acts of collaboration. Wikipedia, time banking, there are huge numbers of very positive forms of direct social collaboration, demonetized because of the free duplicability of information.
Uber's
And that has huge potential for being a way of that the commons could operate not just locally but globally. Paul Mason calls it a post-capitalist economy. So the sharing economy is a degeneration of the gift economy. But both of them, I would argue, are liberating of the social imagination in how to use sheer sociality. How might we here now go about meeting our needs together. We're meeting one need, our intellectual stimulation need. How about food, for example? Well, these new technologies are allowing us to think about how we might communicate over distances in person, virtually, about these matters and carry them out. So it's been hijacked, but could be brought back and re-socialized.
It sounds like piece work, P-I-E-C-E, piece work, I'll take home these 10 shirts to wash and iron, and I'll sit at home and wait for a phone call and then go drive my car.
On the transportation front, one of the co-ops we visited in Havana is a transportation cooperative. They run small buses on fixed routes, and it is a self-managed transportation system. Do you remember how many drivers they had?
Lots of, hundreds of.
It's quite extensive. You see these small yellow buses going down the streets of Havana with Cooperativa written in large letters on the side. So they've and the drivers and the mechanics who repair them have general assemblies. I think it's monthly they meet to make decisions and to give guidance to the managers who make the day-to-day operational decisions for the cooperative.
Liz, did you want to say something?
Just back on the Uber drivers, there was a conference that I saw, I think results are available online, on platform cooperativism, which is platform being the web. And it was basically in response to the sharing economy and the importance of learning from it while critiquing it, as Scott said. But I was just going to comment, like the taxi workers in New York were really close to and a big difference, the taxis are also lease drivers. They have to pay for their cab every day. And so this organization was like an alternative union because they weren't allowed to be in a union. They weren't admitted into unions, so they weren't as contract workers. Now they are affiliated with the AFL-CIO, which is interesting. But there was no protections for the drivers, no health, no safety, nothing. But the reason that the taxi industry was highly regulated, and you had to have a medallion, which cost a fortune. So that's why the individuals couldn't own their own car and drive it. So Uber circumvented all of this, which is critiquable in the first place. So it's a very interesting mix of issues. But it was very hard on the taxi workers when Uber comes in there and people are getting cheaper than a cab ride for the reason that they don't have this high expense.
Yeah, we have a friend who is a retired taxi driver who worked for many years to get his medallion.
Right.
And then he could retire because he had his own car and someone else drove it. But he got income from it. So now his retirement
Or you could sell it.
is, and you can't sell a medallion now.
Oh, yeah, you can.
You still can? Well, maybe.
They're just very expensive.
I don't know.
Bay
I
Area,
mean,
we're talking about.
yeah, so I don't know. But his retirement is gone.
Yeah.
I was going to say that in European socialism or socialism like down under, where everyone has a guaranteed income, the gig economy would work. If in fact the government could get enough revenue out of the gig or shared economy to pay for health services and for when people were out of work, etc. But the irony is, in the United States, we don't have any of that. Basically.
We don't even have health insurance.
Yeah,
We don't have health care.
Yeah, so it's really the starvation economy that we have in the U.S. and that everyone's made hungry.
That's the new economy, it's the starvation economy.
Oh, yeah, that's what Uber drivers come from. It's people who
Yeah.
don't have work.
Right.
You know.
Now, there's
Um,
another comment here.
You talked, the third pillar was equality, is that we need an alternative culture. How do you establish an alternative culture? I was thinking, we have practically every college and university has business schools, even the liberal
That's a
arts.
problem.
So we need a school for the commons and for alternatives and,
And there are lots of schools, informal schools for the commons. I mean, little organizations like the Center for Global Justice. All of the sort of recent interest in spirituality, I think, speaks to this need for equality. I was thinking of the Commons in Brooklyn and the Brecht Forum, where, of course, a lot of this was taught. The liberal arts is also where a lot of this is taught. And also at universities, at the same time that universities were developing business schools throughout the 60s and 70s, Bob Stone was sitting in faculty meetings saying, if you're going to have a course on business ethics, we have to have a course on Marxist ethics. And they all went, what? we can't do that.
that's why the language
so-
is so important.
So, within the university itself, there has been a huge struggle between, the people who want to just change the university into a vo-tech school and have everyone, trained to this idea that education is to get a job and to do business and the liberal arts are just gone.
But
We tend to think of education as something that is done in schools.
Yeah, which is.
The reality is that all of the institutions of society educate us.
including
Yeah, like-
cooperatives.
And
Yeah, but like
cooperatives,
TV.
exactly, that's the point I wanted to get to. The cooperatives, by providing a different kind of set of relationships within the workplace, are a way of building that alternative culture that is needed for a more humane society.
Yeah, if you can have equality at work or influence at your job, why not in your, in the building you live in, other areas of your life?
Does Bernie Sanders ever talk about anything like this in his many speeches? Did he ever?
Have you got your third provision on the back?
Yeah. Here is a 12-step program
He's supposed
from
to
Bernie Sanders, and cooperatives is one of
Yeah.
the things on the list, you see?
Oh, I forgot to read the back of the t-shirt.
that's
Yeah, I heard of those other points, but I never heard about co-ops.
Yeah, not much has been said in the campaign about cooperatives, unfortunately.
The concept would be to establish funding, a fund, a loan fund, that would be renewed by paybacks, to help workforces to either buy out their employees or to start from the ground up.
You might mention New York City.
New York City under de Blasio has established $1 million fund of this kind. And all of a sudden, New York is leaping into the vanguard.
Oh, it was before. That's why you did it.
Well, that's true, I guess. But
Vanguard of what?
of the expansion of the worker cooperative movement. And Corbyn in the UK, his people have a similar proposal. It goes to the heart of capitalism by taking the means of, peacefully allowing the workers to take over the means of production by violence and startups.
Yeah, Bernie doesn't talk a lot about cooperatives, but other people on the left who are talking about alternatives are certainly talking about cooperatives.
You also said the idea of the commons needs to be defended and reclaimed. Who are the defenders of the commons? Are there legal law professors or lawyers, that attorneys where they can specialize in this and, you know, make this their profession? I mean, to me, that's the concept that has to get out there. The commons.
Well, the struggle's
Well-
over public education. I mean, in Mexico, you see it. Don't see enough struggle in the US, but it's definitely.
Well, there's the environmental side. I mean, these people, there are law firms that have been defending small towns in Pennsylvania that outlawed fracking, same with Colorado. And the political process was, oh, well, small towns and counties don't have the power to ban fracking. It's a state legislature control thing, and they've gone against it. But there are people that traveled around the country and worked on these local environmental laws that were passed by localities versus, you know, the big corporation-controlled state legislature and, of course, nationalists. I mean, one of the things that's going on right now, I guess you'd call this the commons, the ability to know what's in your food, you know? and you know, I mean, that's the problem with even the politics of Bernie. Bernie's closer to all this than a lot of people, but, you know, there's this senator from Michigan, Stavehorn, and she's actually wants everyone to have a cell phone and look at some kind of one of those pictures of all those lines and everything, or to call a 1-800 number instead of just writing it in English for everyone to see whether there's genetically modified organisms used in the processing of a certain food. I mean, to me, it's like, you know, it's just absurd that. But the understanding of what the commons are is really far out there. I mean, they're talking about branding national parks. So you'd go to see you go see Grand Canyon and say, brought to you by AT&T or Motorola's. And it's just, I mean, it's already going on when you hear about sports, because all these sports arenas, in fact, are the AT&T arena or whoever, you know. And to me, it's like, I don't know when it's going to stop, you know.
Now, the whole controversy around fracking is a good example of you know, communities that are trying to protect their water commons
Right.
by banning fracking. And then you find the you know, these fossil fuel companies that have great power at the state level frequently, passing legislation that deny localities the power to, you know, ban fracking within their jurisdiction. You know, basically, you know, they want to be able to privatize the resources under the ground, even though it may pollute the water, making it undrinkable. That's a big issue here in San Miguel. You know, our aquifer is an important commons that we all depend upon, and it's being exploited and privatized and depleted by agribusiness, and the political authorities are not responsive to the common good, but rather beholden to agribusiness, and allows them to continue to, you know, to deplete the aquifer until it's all gone.
So we all defend the commons. All of us do. In our, you know, communities and in our local activism.
And even the most vicious capitalist firm must organize and tap creative collective power of teamwork, of mutual trust, of collaboration in their workplaces. Preserving always the right to cycle
Withdraw.
the surplus value thereby created. But at a certain point, you have to recognize that the profit system isn't working, and this is the source of value, the collaborative, cooperative labor side of it. And then you go back to what Cliff is talking about,
And maybe
and re-socializing, recommoning.
maybe that's what you learn when you work at a cooperative, is that the source of value comes from the collaboration of people working, rather than, you know, the person who made the initial investment or something like that.
Except in a capitalist enterprise, that cooperation is not in the consciousness of the workers, but rather it is something that is managed and by the management's coordination of activities. In other words, it's a cooperation that is external to the workers, rather than something in their consciousness and through their you know, capacity as human agents.
I rarely hear factory workers in the United States talk about the companies they're working for in a positive way. Man, you know, it's always us versus them versus, and some of the anger is there.
Well, everybody around the world is angry. And in a way, it's kind of scary.
Including the 1%, because
Yeah.
some of them at least see the dangers involved in their policies.
I ran into a striking fact the other day, reading Rick Wolf's book on democracy at work. And he cites it elsewhere as a pivotal point for him. Until the late 70s, for 150 years, the average income of the average American increased. And then it stopped. So from 1980 to now, that phenomenon, that expectation that there would always be, on the other end, improvement, getting ahead, that's over.
Well, ask your grandchildren how much money do they make, and then ask their parents, you know.
But, you know, I think the whole problem, though, is that we're still talking in terms of productivity and wage growth and things like that. And in fact, you know, the new environmental crisis that most people that aren't bought off by the oil companies realize is that it can't go on. You know, I mean, we can't just keep getting more and more wages or you know, more money in our pockets to buy more gimmicks to enhance our lives, because basically it's all ruining the Earth's atmosphere and the oceans and the groundwater and everything. So basically, you know, I mean, an idea of a co-op might have been the old hippie commune of the 60s and 70s in New Mexico or something. And some of those places are still working in the Midwest for some reason. And my stepson, when he was going to university, they were working on what was called sustainable economy or sustainable living. And that, a lot of the young people realize that basically because they have high student loan problems. You know, if they go out and live on a co-op or a commune, they're not making any money, so student loan thing just is off somewhere in their mind. So actually the indebtedness of Western society is making it so the younger generations, they're not buying cars. I mean, the American car companies are really disturbed that these kids coming out of college don't want to buy a car. They live in New York City, and then of course, or they call up Uber or something. But you know, the whole idea that everyone grows up and buys a home. Well, you can't buy a home when you already owe more than a house mortgage for your university degree, or buy a car, which, you know, cars are just they're an incredible capitalist tool. You know, they have a limited lifespan.
There's a reason why there's a reason why kids have debts, you know, that why they incur debts to go to university is so that they will conform.
Yeah.
Because they have so much debt on their backs
Yeah.
that they have to conform.
But it sort of bit capitalism on the tail, because basically what happened was now they're not going to buy new homes, right? Or used homes or whatever. They're not going to buy cars, you know?
Yeah, I don't know if we need a new jumbo airliners. You know, airplanes are terrible.
Oh, the latest jumbo is actually a big money loser, and the first jumbo liner nearly broke Boeing. You know, they put up a billboard in Seattle that said, "Last person that leaves Seattle, turn out the lights." I mean, that was, you know, and I mean, Europe got sort of into that same kind of thing that the U.S. was, you know, bigger, better, bigger, better. But I think now, because of the economy, there has to be an alternative to capitalism, and I think the young people are going to do it, because we're all living on nice pensions because we worked and lived during a period of relative prosperity, I think.
It's happening now.
Yeah.
It certainly is happening now.
Well, we've had an interesting and wide-ranging discussion. Thank you all for participating.
Thank you.